Hi, this is Ian. This video is about Japanese knives, and I have 10 different knives here to talk about and kind of give you an idea of what different kinds of knives there are, what they're used for, my own preferences, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to be going from my left, from my most used knives, all the way to my right, which are the least used knives in my own kitchen. So in the very beginning, the first one is Guto. Guto is the Japanese version of a chef's knife. This is a 210 millimeter Guto. And this also has a Japanese handle, sometimes called a wa handle. And the Japanese handle tends to be lighter because of the material and the fact that the metal of the knife only goes part way through. It doesn't go all the way through. And there are no rivets like the Western style knives you would see on German and other European style knives. So 210 millimeter, that's about 8.5 inches, very common size. This is the knife I use every single day. It's very, very sharp, very thin, very useful in the kitchen. So Guto is a Japanese chef's knife. I highly recommend these. Next, my next favorite style knife is called Petit. And Petit is usually called a utility knife in the Western knife language. And this is a 150 millimeter Petit, which is a common size. I love it because it works both in your hand for cutting, peeling, and things that you would normally use a paring knife for. Works just as well for that, but also you can put it on the board and do cutting with it. So very versatile. I use this every single day. I always highly recommend getting a Petit knife to complement the Guto. Very, very useful. The third most used knife in my kitchen, I use this almost every day as well, is a serrated bread knife. So this is a 240 millimeter or 9.5 inch serrated bread knife. And pretty much it's the only reason I have it is to cut bread. Crusty bread is no problem when you have a serrated knife. So it can cut other things as well, but for me, it's all about cutting crusty bread. Works really well for that. So a longer serrated knife is better than shorter ones, I believe. So go longer if you can. That way you can do long draws and get the bread cut without having to do a whole bunch of sawing. Next is the Santoku. Santoku means 3 virtues or 3 uses in Japanese. And this is supposed to be able to do fish, vegetables, and meat. And that's the whole reason why it's called Santoku. It's a very, very popular style of home kitchen knives versus the Guto is professional cooks usually prefer the Guto for the fact a few different reasons, but one is the longer length. So this is a 180 millimeter, very typical Santoku size. One of the reasons why people, I think, like it is because, in general, Japanese blades are like this, but especially the Santoku, and the next one I'll talk about, has a pretty flat profile on the belly here. So instead of using it for rock cutting, which it can work for rock cutting, it's very useful for push cutting or cutting up and down. And because there's a wide area that will make the contact of the board in one hit, it's very useful for that kind of use. So Santoku, very useful. I would never pick this up compared to a Guto for me, but sometimes if I need a shorter blade, then this is the one that I would want to use on the board. If I want to use it in the hand, then the Petit is the one. Next one is sort of similar to that, is Nakidi. Nakidi means to cut vegetables, and sometimes it's called a cleaver, although I don't think that's maybe the best way to think about what a Nakidi does. Nakidi has this rectangular shape, very, very flat profile on the belly here. And again, just like the Santoku, it can make contact with the board, and you can cut a lot of vegetables very quickly with this kind of knife. So I used to use this a lot more, but after I got a Guto and the Santoku, after getting used to having a sharp pointed tip, I started missing that, so I don't pick this up nearly as much anymore. But if I have to do a whole bunch of cutting of vegetables, maybe a certain kind that does not need a tip, for example, cabbage to make sauerkraut or something like that, then I might use this. But otherwise, it doesn't get too much use in my kitchen anymore. When people are thinking about getting a nakiri, I always say, why don't you look at maybe the Santoku or even the Guto, because those are probably a little bit more versatile than having a squared off end, tip end. Next for me is the paring knife. So a lot of people would put the paring knife really higher up in a priority list, but for me, the Petit does the same thing as a paring knife, but I can also use it on the board, and I appreciate the extra length. So this is a 100 millimeter paring knife, and it's a nice knife. It works in your hand, but it doesn't quite work on the board, and it's a little too short for me. So for me, I don't really get that much use out of it, but I can see why people would want to have a paring knife around. But for me, the Petit is by far more useful than the paring knife. Next, I have a different kind of Guto. This has a little bit more of a Western chef knife profile here. You can see the belly is more rounded. Also, the handle is one that the metal goes all the way through and goes to the end. So this does not have rivets, but the metal does go all the way through, and it's quite back heavy. The handle is quite heavy, so the balance point is quite different compared to the Japanese style handle on this Guto. So this is an older knife that I've been using for a long time. I got a long time ago, and while it's a very good knife, it's much heavier than my other Guto, and because of that, as well as some other issues, also this round belly, it's not my own preferred profile of a blade for my all-purpose chef's knife or Guto. So it doesn't get that much use anymore, although it's still a very good knife. The last three are traditional single bevel knives. In Japan, traditionally the knives were single bevel, and there are many, many different kinds of single bevel knives with very specific purposes. So I just had the three most well-known, most common single bevel knives, but if you start researching traditional Japanese single bevel knives, you'll find so many different kinds, dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of shapes and sizes and uses that are meant for that one thing. So also, traditional Japanese blades were not stainless steel. Some of these here are stainless steel, and some are a mix between carbon steel and stainless steel. These traditional knives here I have are carbon steel, which means that they need a little bit more care. They are prone to rust and staining, and but they do work really well because they're carbon steel for their own intended purposes, and the fact that they sharpen extremely well and very easily, and they get very sharp when you sharpen on whetstones. So the first very common one is the Debba. Debba is the traditional fish butchery knife. So if I had a whole fish, I would pick up the Debba and maybe fillet it or take the head off or do whatever I need to. It's very heavy, the spine is very thick, and has a certain shape. It's a single bevel knife, meaning that this side has a bevel on it, and the other side is not just flat, but it's actually slightly concave. So it takes some getting used to. If you have never filleted a fish with this kind of knife, it's a big difference between using a chef's knife, for example, and a single bevel Debba. Something like this is quite different. But it's fun to use. I don't think it's necessary. Actually, none of these are really necessary. All I would really need would be the first three, and then the rest are sort of nice to have, or depending on your mood, or it starts to become a collector's thing. The next single bevel traditional knife is the Yanagiba. Yanagiba, this is a 270 millimeter sashimi knife that's basically what Yanagiba is used for, is to have that fish that's already prepared with the debba. You have fillets that you need to cut into smaller pieces for sashimi or sushi or things like that. That's what it's very, very good for. That's why the length is there for slicing. It's quite thin as well, and it works really well for that. It doesn't work well for many other things. I would not call this an all-purpose blade. If you try using this as a chef's knife, you're probably going to be disappointed because it doesn't do a lot of those things well. But for slicing fish, you could also slice other meats or proteins, but it's meant for slicing fish, and for that it's really, really great. And then finally, the last traditional single bevel knife is the usuba. Usuba translates to thin blade. It's the traditional vegetable cutting knife. And in Japan, sometimes you see very, very ornate vegetables cut into certain shapes that are garnish on your plate. And those are traditionally made using the usuba. And the usuba, like the name says, is very, very thin. The spine is not that thin, but because it's a single bevel knife, the blade itself is very, very thin, and it can do all that detailed work. One of the most common uses is called the katsuramuki, where you take a piece of daikon or cucumber and you just shave, go around, and you're shaving a very, very thin piece that becomes long, and then eventually you cut it into very, very fine julienne. You would see that kind of daikon or preparation or some kind of vegetable preparation on a fancy sashimi plate, for example. So the usuba, unfortunately, it's all the way over here on this side where I don't use it that much, just because I don't do that kind of cutting. But it's a fun knife to have. It's a fun knife to experiment with once in a while. Sometimes I feel like doing some kind of decorative work or having this kind of precision to do something, and this is a great knife for that. But for everyday use, definitely for me, it's not something I use or is really needed. It's just more for fun. So really, those traditional single bevel knives, they're fun. They work for their intended purposes, but definitely for me, they're on this side where I don't really need to use them every single day. Again, these are the every single day use ones. And then over here are the ones that they're useful, but it's not something that I would use every single day. So in another video, I will talk about some of the accessories that might be very useful for having Japanese knives, and also sharpening. So hopefully this is somewhat useful, and if you have any questions about Japanese knives, this is just scratching the surface. So if you're curious about what kind of knife to get or where to start looking or have any other questions, please send me an email, and I'm always happy to talk knives anytime. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thanks.